know there's a common belief that states only about 10% of our brains are accessible. So likewise, in the army, I was taught that about 40% of our physical bodies are accessible. So while you feel like you've reached your limit or your breaking point, you're only about 40% done. And unless you convince your body to perform beyond what is expected of it, you'll never know how far you can really go. My name is Lieutenant Gaurav, and I'm a commissioned Army officer in the infantry of the Singapore Armed Forces. I'm currently studying in NITK as a BTech student. I want to shine light on certain experiences from my service that have played a major role in shaping my mindset. I was 17 when I enlisted into the Army. National service is compulsory in Singapore for all male citizens, and they can be enlisted into either the civil defense, the police force, or the armed forces. This was a point in my life where I was questioning everything I was doing. I wondered why I spent my 18th birthday leopard crawling in the mud with machine gun bullets being fired over my head, while my friends were back in college, bunking classes and going for trips. So Army was a huge culture shock, but we grew on to slowly accept that lifestyle. And the lesser accepting you were of it, the more difficult things would undoubtedly get. My training started with basic military training, or BMT, where we graduated from as trained soldiers. After BMT, I was posted to Officer Cadet School, or OCS. OCS meant 9 months of intense training to become an officer. While there were a few different vocations I could end up in, I guess I was destined to fall into infantry. For those of you who don't know, infantry by the Wikipedia definition is the regiment that engages in military combat by foot. So we don't rely on vehicles or mounts as such, although we could use their support. What we understood by infantry was simply a lot of walking and jungle-related stuff. Days would go by in a flash because training and lectures kept us so preoccupied. We would eat, sleep, wake up, bathe, do everything at a certain designated time. Difficult times seem to come by in abundance, and you start missing everything you had until that point. Even the comfort of just sitting at home, your parents' unconditional love, some legitimate food, it all starts to kick in, and it kicks in hard. Times would get especially tough if we got into a loop of thinking that the world outside of camp is leading a normal life while we aren't, and if what we are training so hard for even worth it. And when's the breaking point going to come? But tough times don't last, tough people do. And this was reiterated to me several times before it actually started to make sense. We were trained to use different rifles, operate demolition weapons, do close combat fighting, and building assault operations, which were some of the fun parts of training. We had exercises where we'd have to dig for several days in a row. We would go to the jungle every other week to train for firefighting and survival. Camping for a few days in a row were the toughest. We had route marches, which are basically very long walks with very heavy loads. The longest that I've marched was 32 kilometers. And in between that march, we had a river crossing and a range shooting assessment, passing which led us to earning our first badge, the Combat Skills Badge. We soon reached our first overseas training, which was in the rainforests of Brunei. It was informally understood that infanteers never really become genuine infanteers until they underwent the baptism of fire, known as Brunei. The terrain was no match to the one back in Singapore. As part of our training there, we did the Jungle Confidence Course, or JCC, which we had to pass in order to earn the JCC badge. It was also a test of our spirit as infantry cadets. So JCC is a 9-day navigation and survival exercise. Under Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the most essential needs of a human being are food, water, clothing, and shelter. Take that away or diminish its supply, and anyone's survival will be severely tested. We had 2 days' worth of food to split over the 9 days. We had to replenish water supply from the rivers and streams. I had about half a biscuit for breakfast, and I used to eat raw chilies and lime that I found during my trek just so I had something to chew in my mouth. We climbed up countless knolls and hills and climbed down several ravines as part of the navigation. We also climbed 2 mountains, Mount Biang and Telugong, and climbing would get even more tedious if our loads were soaked from all the river crossing. Each of us were already carrying about 25 kilograms of load. The nights would get so dark that it would get difficult to see our own hands in front of our face. And it would rain every single day for 6 to 7 hours at a stretch. And we felt every second of it. There were cadets who got foot rots from wearing wet boots for a very long period of time. And that's why it is essential to try and dry your boots and feet whenever you're in the jungle. But in reality, nothing ever stayed dry in Brunei. I used to wake up at night drenched from head to toe, freezing in the cold wind, with heavy rain pouring on me for hours. And all that we could do was to sit there and endure and wait for the rain to stop. So one of these evenings, I hit a very low point. I was just exhausted, hungry, broken, and cold. I took out my waterproof notebook and I started journaling my thoughts. And during this time when everything had just boiled down to my survival and my most basic needs, there was nothing that mattered more to me than my family and my closest friends. I remembered the recent terrorist attack in Paris and how I didn't want anybody that I love to ever be in a situation like that. No one deserved to be in that place. I wanted to fight for that cause, and I realized my role in the fight against such terrorism was to train myself for it, which at that point meant to finish the course I was currently in the middle of. So I used that as motivation, and as long as I could breathe, I pushed myself to finish the course. For the survival assessment, I remember standing 3 hours under the rain trying to build a shelter. We had to build a fireplace, a monitor lizard trap, fishing rods. We also had to carve out spoons and forks out of wood. We had to identify edible plants and do poison checks, and we were assessed on all of it. Apart from that, we also had to kill a quail bird with our bare hands, skin it, separate its internals from its edible parts, identify if it was infected through the gallbladder, and then eat it if we wanted to. But honestly, who wouldn't? We hadn't eaten anything for days. But I still found it very uncomfortable to kill the bird, not just because it was a living being whose heartbeat I could literally feel in the palm of my hands, but also because I have a slight phobia towards birds and the way they flap their wings. But I decided to push my limits, and while I held the bird in one hand, I pulled its head off with the other, which was a very difficult thing to do, but I guess it had to be done. I wanted to use the internals as bait for the monitor lizard trap, but my trap wasn't completely built yet, so I decided to keep the internals safely at my survival site. I did not comprehend that my site would smell like raw quail for the next 2 days. I did not wash the blood off my hands because I was trying to save water for drinking. And when I tried to steam the quail, it started to rain, so I could not even cook it properly. I had to eat the bird half raw, and it tasted all right. That night, my buddy ended up injuring his knee with a Swiss knife, and it was a very deep cut. So I helped him dress up the wound and made sure he got adequate amount of rest, because the following day was our final day of navigation, and it was not going to be an easy trek. And if he dropped out of the course, it would mean all of us failing as a section. But he was determined. He was determined because the next day he was probably the fastest guy. It's like every time we would reach the peak of a hill to rest, he would come and say, "Guys, let's carry on. We have a deadline to meet, let's go." And it's commendable that he finished the entire trek with his injured knee, because to me it seemed like it would be difficult to even walk with that leg. So I was just astonished by the scope of things one could achieve, only if they took the initiative to push their bodies harder than what they thought they could. The struggle we faced each day was raw and deep. Never in our comfortable, nestled lives had we been pushed physically, mentally, and emotionally. Earning the badge meant one thing, but it was also the most defining 9 days of our lives. We'll never forget the brothers we survived JCC with and the newfound gratitude that we had for life itself. A new set of challenges lay ahead, and as we embarked on our final overseas training, which was in the open mountainous terrains of Taiwan. One of the exercises there consisted of endless hours of navigation and 6 back-to-back firefighting missions. And when we got done with that, we were surprised by 2 more missions. And this was at a stage where we were just mentally and physically drained out. But we mustered up all of our energy, and even though we were demoralized, we strived for mission success. The beautiful views that the mountains offered really made the grueling climbs worth it. OCS constantly taught me to step out of my comfort zone because that is the only way I was able to get any work done. Sometimes you just have to put a mental block for your excuses, suck up whatever energy you have inside, and channel it towards getting your work done. Life, after all, is a manifestation of where your energy is flowing. A few other important lessons I learned was to never compromise on performance under extreme stress, and to also prepare for the worst-case scenario in day-to-day activities. Also, if you've invested your body, your time, your blood, sweat, and tears into something, whatever that may be, then you might as well make the most out of it. There's no point in doing it half-heartedly. Soon came our commissioning day, and this was the day we'd be designated with tremendous responsibilities. I was 18 when I commissioned as an officer, and there was a lot of anticipation. The most awaited time for us cadets finally arrived when our parents came and donned the second lieutenant insignia on our shoulders. And in a lot of armies around the world, it is the parents who come and don the officer's rank on the cadets, because I believe that is the kind of emotional significance it holds. You know, we owed it to them, apart from the army, because their support is what kept us going most of the times. So commissioning day also put an end to my training phase. After commissioning, I was appointed as a platoon commander. We also underwent the trainer's qualification course that made us qualified trainers who were eligible enough to train recruits. My job would be to lead recruits, or rather civilians who had just enlisted into the army, and train them to become soldiers. As a platoon commander, I was responsible for the training, safety, morale, welfare, and discipline of all my men, a lot of whom were elder to me. We trained the recruits from morning to evening, and at night when they went to sleep was when I did my administrative work and reports. Looking back, I think I would do it all over again, because some of the times that I spent in camp were the best of my times. One of the evenings, rather one night when I was on duty, I found out that my grandfather had passed away. And Dadu was an exceptional doctor and an army officer in the Indian Army. He was awarded the Sena Medal for Gallantry in the War of 1971. Really broke my heart that I did not get the chance to meet him since the time I had commissioned as an officer, but I do try to keep his values and principles in my heart at all times. When I learned of his demise, I could have applied for a leave and been there for the funeral with my family, but I had very important training to conduct, and I wanted to finish all my work before I could finally leave. So about 2 weeks later, I attended some of the final rituals in India. And when I came back to Singapore, I reported straight to camp from the airport, where I was informed that I received an early promotion from second lieutenant to full lieutenant, which was very overwhelming for me to accept at that point. I like to believe that my grandfather left that as a blessing for me before he finally passed. It was pretty nostalgic to train recruits because at some point we were in their shoes as well. And seeing how far we came to be commanders always let me have hope for every recruit I trained. In retrospect, none of this seemed possible. I'll give you the example of route marches. As a recruit, route marches were my most feared part of training, and I used to hate route marches. But by the time I was training guys like me, I had grown to love route marches. I forced myself to embrace every route march until it eventually became one of my strongest points. Many times before graduating, recruits have written letters to me saying that I've been a major inspiration to them, especially during the route marches, and it has actually helped them to carry on walking. And as a commander, knowing just that much was very reassuring indeed. Overall, I trained 3 batches of recruits. I worked with a very dedicated team of commanders. I met people from various walks of life and got the opportunity to learn a lot of different things. Tough times were too tough, but the fun times were no less either. And looking back, I would do it all over again. My service ended when I was 19 and I joined college right after that. Hostel life here too does get difficult sometimes, but I'm glad that living in camp has made me accustomed to a certain way of life. So every time I feel like I have things to complain about, remembering my training days always makes me want to be grateful for the things that I already have and put my existing resources to use. My purpose of speaking here is not to inspire or motivate anyone, because I only know how to do that in the army, not outside of it. However, I do want people to understand that as young students straight out of school or college, there is no limit to the scope of things that you can achieve. With the right amount of push and initiative, and maybe you will fail once in a while, but that is no reason to stop trying and not try harder the next time. I would say overall, my takeaway from my service is that as human beings, it is our job to push ourselves little by little every single day, mentally and physically, and to grow in that process. I'm sure all of us find ourselves in difficult situations where we doubt our capabilities. But what makes the ultimate difference is if we accept the need to change that doubt and how hard we try to change it. I think what we as a generation should focus on are the bigger things that are happening in the world, the more important things that deserve our attention and time. Care about the people that matter to us while we still have the chance to. Be grateful for what we have than what we don't, and strive to make an impact on anything or anyone's life, as long as it is for the better. All we need to learn is to give ourselves a little push. Thank you.